Good afternoon, everybody. Karel van Nieuwenhuizen told me that this was actually your last meeting of this academic year, that after this meeting you will not see each other anymore, at least not on a structural basis, included in the teacher education curriculum that you are following right now. So it's a real privilege to have you here as a kind of dessert included in your teacher training studies. My name is Pieter Verstraeten. I teach history of education at the Faculty of Education and Educational Sciences and Psychology. And together with Kaat Wils and Patrick de Vlieger, a couple of years ago, we founded this Disability History Lecture Series. The aim of the series is to broaden the knowledge about disability history within different disciplines, among others educational sciences, anthropology and history. And so in that context we are very thankful to Karel van Nieuwenhuizen that he included the lecture of today, the lecture which will be delivered by Sebastian Barsch in your curriculum. Why is that? Because according to us, disability issues are very relevant for future teachers. They touch upon many diversity topics, and that again touches upon the particular course that you followed this semester. That being said, I think I just would like to introduce today's speaker, Sebastian Barsch. We met one another for the first time on a conference, I think in 2010 in Lancashire. It was a disability history conference, and since then we worked and collaborated together for many occasions, many times. We co-organized a conference entitled The Imperfect Historian. We recently founded a blog journal, the Public Disability History Journal, and apart from that we share a lot of other interests, but I will not tell you more about those. I just would like to say that I'm very happy to have Sebastian Barsch here. He is an expert with regard to diversity issues in teacher training curricula. He himself is head of a teacher training institute at the University of Cologne, so he's very specialized and knows what he is talking about. Today he will introduce us to a wonderful presentation, undoubtedly, which has as a title, Traditions of Othering Teaching Disability History. And I just give you the floor for the next 50 of your one.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and well, I hope I don't bore you the next couple of minutes. So if I talk too fast or if I talk any rubbish, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. So English is not my first language, and well, maybe there are some errors or mistakes I'm doing here. Please forgive me if I stick a bit to the text also. I try to talk to you, but from time to time I need some orientation within my text. Okay, the title of my presentation is Traditions of Othering, Teaching Disability History, and although the title says that it is all about disability history, many minutes I will stick in the present time, because I will tell you a bit about deaf culture, about deaf culture's contemporary historical consciousness, and how this is a valuable topic for history lessons in school. So there will be different chapters or different parts of my presentation where I switch from the present time to the past time, just to explore what is othering and what is the topic all about for school education. Although, well, diversity was some kind of a normal condition of living, it also every time was a kind of exclusion factor for people who are different from the majority. In my presentation I will even focus on issues of diversity in history, teaching, and I will refer to the example of deaf culture. And the deaf culture is, well, something which arose from the burgeoning field of special education in the 19th century, where the struggle between hearing people and deaf people and the ideas how to deal with deafness arose. And these times still influence historical consciousness of this group today, and gives us some interesting, well, insights of diversity in societies. Before I begin with disability history, I'd like to begin with two propositions. You can see them there. First, every time humans come together, they run through a process of group formation, and groups tend to view other groups negatively. So this is just a proposition. Maybe it's a very pessimistic view of, well, humanity, but let me just explain how I come to this thesis. I'd like to tell you a bit about the topic othering. Did anybody of you hear did anybody of you hear the word othering before, or what is meant with othering? Oh, okay. Actually, othering is some kind of a sociological theory which deals about how groups identify themselves and how they differ from other groups. And here you can see some kind of bad English. So the core of the idea of othering, of the process of othering, is the questions, what is me and what is they? So what defines me as a person, and what defines me as a member of a distinct group, and what is all the other people around there? How can I categorize them, and what kind of groups do they form? And well, these two questions target the core proposition of my talk. Which group is a distinct part of my identity? And let me just explain a bit more what I mean with group identity. So, groups in a way are in a state of constant flux. So everybody of us is in different groups in different times of the day. So today, for the next minutes, if anybody would ask me what kind of group we are, I could say we're academics in a way. We're very nice, smart, good-looking people. And well, this is our group identity for the next hour or so. And if I could go further, deeper into the subject, I could also say only very few of us would be part for a so-called workers class. So I guess the most of us are from an academic background, and most of us will stay in an academic background. And you can see this on a more narrow view. What is a group? You can have different identities, like being a skater or being a punk. So just some basic ideas about what group identities are. And of course, there are much bigger groups which differ in a way from each other much more than these groups do. Because the skater, for example, he can be a skater for an hour of a day, and the other time he can be a father, or he can be a bank account manager or so on. So he's in different identities during the day. And there are more stable identities, like national identities. So maybe some people here in the room consider themselves as being Belgian, and at least one considers himself as being German. And you can even see the appearance of the groups totally different from each other. So I think this is the German group, yeah, and this is the Belgian group. So we have bigger, wider group identities as well. And we have so many other ways groups can found themselves, can identify themselves. This can come over religious confession, ethnical backgrounds, gender, and so on. And maybe also disabilities. I say maybe because, I come to this later, I doubt a bit that disability is a category or a description for a group which is, which has very much in common. But later to this. Well, I guess all of this isn't very new for you. We all know people cluster to groups, and this is quite normal for living conditions for humans, and only shows the diversity of humanity. But to come back to my thesis, it's maybe not that easy that there is just a group identity process. The group identity processes also lead to distinct special behaviors. So I'll tell you a little story now. On July the 11th, 1954, a group of 11 boys from Oklahoma City drove in a bus to a summer camp called Robbers Cave State Park. They talked about their hobbies, their favorite baseball teams, and the jobs of their fathers. So typical stuff young people are talking about. Well, the state park still exists. This is the entrance of it. When they arrived at the campground, they moved into their cabins and explored the environment, strolled around, saw what kind of trees are there and so on. And at first they thought they had been alone in the camp. But then the next day they realized that in another corner of the area, another group of boys had stayed in another cabin. And they could only hear them, they couldn't see them. Actually, the summer camp wasn't a normal camp for children, it was a psychological experiment. The head of the summer camp was Muzaffar Sharif, a psychologist from the Oklahoma State University. And with the experiment, he wanted to find out the mechanisms that makes groups to enemies, and he wanted to find out how he could bring peace to the two groups again. Both groups, by the way, they were from the same social background. They all were members of white Protestant middle class in the Midwest United States. The experimentator applied the test in 3 phases. In the first, the two groups should independently form themselves. In the second phase, he would bring together these groups, and in this phase he wanted to boost the enemyship between both groups. And in the third phase he wanted to pacify this group again by using special methods. I show you, well, there are some moving pictures. When I talk on, just have a look at how the camp was. Yeah. Doesn't work here. So there's no sound, you can listen to me and have a look at this. 1 week after arrival, the two groups had given a name to themselves. You can see here the both experimentators. So the one group called themselves the rattlesnakes, and the others called themselves the eagles. They had patterns. The rattlesnakes, for example, used bad cursing language continuously, and the eagles were always bathing naked. It's just important to say that they didn't have contact to each other at this moment. They, as I told you, only heard that there was another group of boys. The plan was that they still had the groups at this stage about a week and then a day or two separated before they were made to enemies in phase 2. But the boys were far ahead of the plan, the psychologists noticed later. Without even having the other group ever seen, one group started to talk about the others as nigger campers, so it's 1954 in the United States, when they only heard the voices of the others. With the beginning of the next phase, the two groups came in contact to each other. The core of this phase was the enemy construction building. So there were done some competitions, 15 competitions all in all, like baseball plays and tug competitions, you know, where you have to pull on a rope, and the group could win prizes. So what the experimentators tried to do in this phase is to boost the, well, aggression or enemyship between both groups. The consequence of the tournament was that the cohesion within the group grew, while the other group was dismissed and attacked even more than before. However, the extent of hostilities must have surprised even the experimentators. The teams cursed each other. They talked, for example, about the stinkers, the cowards, the communists. So just remember, 1954, United States. And on the evening of the second day, the eagles burned a flag of the rattlesnakes. As Sharif, the experimentator, later wrote, this event made it unnecessary for the experimentators to empower or to boost the enemy ship even more. So they wanted to do more tournament, to do more battle between both groups, but they thought, well, it's working quite good. They already hate each other in a way. It didn't take long for the counter-strike after the Eagles burned the flags. The next evening, the rattlesnakes raided the cabins of the Eagles, torn curtains down and turned over beds. They conquered blue jeans of the group leader, which they used the next day as a banner, which itself contributed with the inscription, "The last of the Eagles." And one day later, the Eagles armed themselves with baseball bats and went to the hut of the rattlesnakes, but they weren't there at the moment, so it didn't come to a fight then. After a series of further clashes, neither group wanted to have something to do with the other. The experimentators were surprised by the very high level of aggression and tension without even boosting the enemy ship. So here you can see one of the culture tournament things the children had to do. Well, in the last part of the experiment, Sharif conducted situations where the groups needed to work together to be successful. Here he wanted to find out how a common interest could pacify the two groups again. So, for example, the van who had to bring food to the camp, and both groups needed this van to get the food. Well, he did strike, and both groups were needed to push the van so that he can drive again. And there were other challenges where the group were forced to somehow share the situation and manage the situation together. And well, he succeeded. At the end of this experiment, the two groups felt themselves as one group. So it's quite interesting. The experiment worked just by having two groups. A situation raised up where the groups boosted themselves and felt themselves as enemies. So there's one more picture. Okay, what's the clue of this story? What I wanted to show you with this example is that, it's quite normal that people who form groups dismiss other groups. So we have a lot of examples in human culture, human history, that this is a very normal thing. Groups build up identities by using concepts of we and they. The process of othering, this is a process of othering, could be internal. There's another picture. Okay. So the process of othering could be an internal one. Like a special group says, we are a group and these are the others. And the process could also be an external one. An external othering process, for example, could be the one that a majority always calls people with specific attributions disabled. Although the diversity of the so-called group is pretty wide. So when I was talking about different groups a couple of minutes ago, like the Belgian people, the skaters and so on, you can say there's, in a way, a common set of attributions that these groups have together. But when we talk about disabled people, we lack these common attributions. Of course, we have blind people, we have deaf people, we have people who need a wheelchair. But the attributes of all these individual persons are not the same. It's not that all need a wheelchair or all need glasses, for example. So it's a problem to subsumize all these under the category disabled. I will come to this later. And in general, this is a problem with external othering. Maybe after a while, the members of this group already, or even think that they're a part of the group, they didn't identify intrinsically by, when people are always called disabled, after a while maybe they think, yes, I'm a part of the disabled community, even without sharing any interest with other disabled people, because they're simply individual people. Psychologically, we have some evidence for effects in schools which work like this. In Germany, until now, we have special schools where people, for example, with learning difficulties, are collected in special schools. And there's an effect called stereotype threat effect, which works like this. If you tell people you're learning disabled all the time, the people think, yes, I am learning disabled, I cannot learn very good. And all their performances are getting lower with the attribution you are learning disabled. By the way, this works quite well if you go in a school class and tell, as a teacher, as an authority person, we all know that girls are not good in mathematics. If you test in this class, the performance is not that good as if you say, we know that all girls are good in mathematics. So you can work with stereotypes and bring groups to identify with these stereotypes. That's the point what I was saying when we talk about othering. The external othering is something which is very problematic, especially for schools and for, well, society in general. Okay. This was more or less my theoretical background, what it was meant with othering. Was it that clear? Was what I meant with that?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So if you have any questions, just tell me. I now continue by turning directly towards disability history, and just please keep in mind what I said about groups and the process of identity shaping, and finally how different groups could be united under the terms of diversity. This will be my conclusion for what do we do in the schools when we talk about disability history. But before, well, I go to history, I will stick in the present times and give you some insights into the deaf culture. And when we look at the history, deafness always has been linked to foolery, and foolery often was linked to, well, animal life. Especially in the past, and sometimes today even also, human culture was intrinsically coupled with the ability to communicate. Indeed, human culture was ascribed to oralist societies only. Oralist means to be able of spoken language. So we have a lot of evidence that societies in the past well, only attributed members of society to be human when they were able to orally speak, which means all these people who are deaf and therefore didn't speak with words haven't considered to be human at all. In fact, a result from this point of view was the social exclusion and segregation of deaf people in specialized institutions. And simultaneously to the segregation and exclusion, people subsumized to this group constituted their own cultures apart from those of the mainstream societies. And when we talk about deaf cultures, we don't mean a subculture from the mainstream society. I'm quoting the historian Sparrow now, who, well, gives some idea what deaf culture is. Quote, "Unlike subcultures or even some ethnic cultures, deaf people possess their own distinct languages, each with a unique vocabulary and grammar. Deaf people also have a shared set of experiences relating to the consequences of deafness in a hearing culture, a shared history, and a distinct set of institutions." Quote end. And more than a few people identify themselves of being members of a group offering resistance to mainstream societies. So we have, I was one behind. So we have really a movement of deaf people saying we are not part of the mainstream society, we have our own culture and we want to stick to our own culture. What is quite interesting in terms of inclusion, where we we all want to decategorize, and we need to be aware that there are groups doing this internal othering who don't want to be decategorized. As deaf identity massively refers to deaf history, deaf culture is an important and fruitful field for historical research. As the American author, historian Susan Birch wrote in her book Signs of Resistance, American Deaf Cultural History, The relationship between deaf citizens and the mainstream society highlights important conflicts over concepts of normality, citizenship, culture, and disability. So, assuming the topic disabilities in general matters history and history teaching, history didactics, and so on, and disability is an issue of cultural diversity, what particular value of deaf history for the history didactics and history teaching can we find out? Matthew Moore and Linda Leviston, these are deaf activists, describe the American deaf culture like this. So another, definition of deaf culture. One possible definition of the US deaf culture is a social, communal, and creative force of, by, and for deaf people based on American Sign Language. It encompasses communication, social protocol, art, entertainment, recreation, for example, sports, travel, and deaf clubs, and worship. It's also an attitude and as such can be a weapon of prejudice. You're not one of us, you don't belong to us. So, this as an example for this, what I said, internal othering. Despite the mighty efforts of generations of oralists, which means people who want to make deaf people talk by spoken words, deaf people still prefer to communicate and mingle with their own kind. That is the psychological basis of deaf culture. Deaf people in the United States have staunchly resisted the unstinting attempts of oralists to use of sign language and assimilate them into the hearing community. The simple fact is that deaf people who attend the common residential schools for the deaf, and no matter what mode of communication is forced on them in the classroom, I later come to different methods of teaching deaf students. There are methods like based on sign language and methods based on spoken language. We can find out that deaf people tend to seek other deaf people for communication because sign language is their native language. And by the way, within the deaf community there are groups refusing integration to the oralist societies in a very radical way. I will now show you a little trailer from a year 2000 documentary called Sound and Fury. And this documentary showed the story of a child called Heather, who was born deaf like her parents. And the question for her parents was whether to give their child a cochlear implant. This is an electronic device which can make deaf children hear. And the choice, pro or con cochlear implant, it's pretty much linked to the age the children can get this, because when it's young, there are good chances that the child can, develop normal speech or speech. And when it's implanted in later ages, it's quite hard that the child can, the person can develop speech. So the question was, should this child get a cochlear implant or not? I will show you this little I hope I will show you the trailer.
Person really can't understand how you could be happy if your child was born deaf.
Why is it so important to be deaf? Yes, deaf people have beautiful language, but you miss out on so many other beautiful things in the world, like music.
I don't care about music. I can't hear it.
I really am happy being deaf. It's very peaceful. Who would want to change that?
Why do you want a cochlear implant now?
Because I want to hear everything.
Forget deaf. You are a mother first and you're a father first. You do what's right for that child.
Your child is blind, and during the surgery that you give him eyesight, what would you do?
With a cochlear implant, the child will be able to hear.
When you hear a house go
I never saw a house do that.
Do we think the implant can kill deaf culture, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Deaf culture is wonderful.
Grandma, she says, I want to communicate. She said,
I never knew that you really didn't accept deafness until now. Heather is my child, and I am not being close-minded. Hearing people have their own way of looking at things. I have a deaf family. That is my life.
Okay. One more try. Okay. I just leave it that there. Okay. It's a very interesting documentary, and it's worth looking at it. In fact, well, in this movie, the parents decided against the cochlear implant, which means the child didn't have well, the ability or the chance to develop speech in an oralist way. And it's quite interesting that there are more than isolated cases of deaf parents who deny their children the chance to hear with the help of medical surgery. And it's quite interesting to debate about this. Is this ethically correct, or is it, well, incorrect? And the idea behind that is that many people with, many deaf people compare cochlear implants to genocide, to their own culture. So it's a very, well, strong opinion, but it's an opinion which arose from the deaf community. With regards to this trailer, a comment on the website YouTube, well, vividly shows the understanding for the position of the parents to, well, deny the cochlear implant. The comment says, the father is afraid of losing his daughter to another culture, the hearing culture. There's a philosopher called Robert Sparrow. He describes the controversy pro or con cochlear implants in his essay Defending Deaf Culture as follows, quote, throughout the 1980s and the early 1990s, deaf people mobilized to protest the use of cochlear implants. Indeed, they have compared it to genocide. They argue that deaf people should not be thought of as disabled, but as a member of a minority group. So, where are the roots of these resistance? We can find them, of course, in history. And there's a quite interesting book by the psychologist Oliver Sacks. He's very famous. He wrote books which were became movies after, like The Awakenings. And he had also wrote a book called Seeing Voices, A Journey into the World of the Deaf. And in the beginning of the book, he asks some simple questions. He asks, have the deaf always and everywhere been seen as handicapped or inferior? Have they always suffered? Must they always suffer segregation and isolation? Can one imagine their situation otherwise? If only there were a world where being deaf did not matter, and in which all deaf people could enjoy complete fulfillment and integration. And in a way, there had been such a world, and Oliver Sacks is writing about this world. And it's a small island called Martha's Vineyard. It's an island at the coast of Massachusetts. Well, you can see, well, you can't see. Peter, you were so good in doing this. It's a typical New England island now. Some presidents have their vacational homes there. And by now it's simply a very expensive place for people who are rich. But in the past, perfect, thanks. In the past, Martha's Vineyard has been an island for deaf settlers, which came around the island at around 1690. And unique to this group was a specific gene mutation, which resulted in a relatively high number of deaf people on the island. So it's about 1 of 4 from time to time who were deaf on this island. Oliver Sacks continues, quote, "By the mid-19th century, scarcely an up-island family was unaffected, and in some villages, the incidence of deafness had risen to 1 in 4. In response to this, the entire community of the island learned sign. And there was a free and complete intercourse between the hearing and the deaf people. Indeed, the deaf were scarcely seen as deaf, and certainly not at all seen as handicapped." Well, there are some stories that the island also was a high place for pirates in the 17th and 18th century. It's not completely sure if this really happened. What we know is that the whole community of the island integrated or included deaf culture in their own culture. And quite interesting to ask, was it deaf culture or was it a distinct own culture? Because if everybody speaks deaf or sign language, there's no difference between the groups. So the common language was, or let's say, Martha's Vineyard was a bilingual island at this time, speaking spoken language and sign language. I will show you a little, contemporary witness who remembered one of the last deaf people living on the island. So it's just a movie clip again when it works. One more time. No. It was very. Was it okay? The sound?
On the father's side, his grandparents were both deaf mutes. His mother wasn't very well after he was born, so he went to live with them. And of course, they didn't speak, so everybody thought he was a deaf mute because he never spoke, because he didn't hear anybody speak. And somebody went there one day and said his name, and he turned his head and said, "I believe he can hear." He didn't hear anybody talk. I guess he didn't think he was supposed to. I don't know. But then they see he was deaf. But as I say, for a year or two they thought he was because he didn't say anything. I don't know whether he didn't cry or what, but he didn't speak. Used to call them deaf and dumb. They weren't deaf and dumb. They just couldn't. They were just deaf. That's all. Of course, they couldn't speak, so they all afterwards they call them deaf mutes. I think they call them hearing impaired now, don't they? Of course, there was a lot of people in town with deaf mutes, so everybody could talk with their hands. It wasn't hard. It wasn't easy because they couldn't spell. See, they never went to school, so they might know the first 2, 3 letters, and you had to guess what the rest of them were. But in the conversation, you could pick it up. You know.
So you could talk to people.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, I could a little. It's been so long now that I forgot a lot of it, a lot of the signs.
What signs do you remember?
What signs do I remember? Remember snow, girl, lie, truth, shoot, dog. I remember quite a lot. They had a different language because I know my father was down on the dock one day and this person come down and he was a deaf mute. And he couldn't understand my father. They had different signs. Some were the same. Of course, they never went off the island, so they kind of instituted their own, you know. And they had a sign for most everybody, for the person. Now, if a fellow he lost his hand in the threshing machine when he was young, and he lost his hand, so that you knew that was Benny Mayle. That was Gregory Mayle's great-grandfather. And Ernest Mayle, his was here because they used to hang May baskets. And they hung a May basket, and he run into somebody's clothesline, pretty and broke his neck. They hit him right across there, so that was a sign for Ernest Mayle. When anybody went like that, he was talking about Ernest. And some of the rest of them, a lot of them I can't remember now. A fellow named Josie West loved to play cards, so we'd go over to the post office. It's where that Lombardi's is now. The mail come in there, and we'd go in there, and he'd be there, loved to play cards. He was a good card player too. They had card parties to the town hall and the store. They played at the store. Sometimes they'd have it at people's houses. They'd have 3, 4 tables, you know. They were good card players because they could concentrate, you know. No distraction. But I remember all the signs. That was diamonds, that was clubs, that was hearts, that was spades. So Phil and I went, he knew the signs and I did, so we cheat. We'd give each other signs. You know I had hearts, see? We were bad.
Before your time, there were more deaf people around Tilmark, weren't there?
Yeah, I think there was. There wasn't too many when I was around. There's about, well, let's see, there's Josie West, Eva Lork, Katie West. There's only about 4 or 5. There was, I know before that there was a lot more. That I don't, before I come around.
Can you show us the alphabet?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z.
And can you count?
6, 7, 8, 9, that's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. One C, C is 100, see?
Great.
Oh dear.
So all I ever wanted to do was go fishing. I went with my father when I guess about 9 or 10, lobstering in the summer, some. And then I used to go with my uncle up in the pond dragging for flounders in the wintertime. That's all I ever wanted to do.
So, interesting situation on this island, on this isolated island where a specific culture arose with spoken and sign language simultaneously existing. The situation changed since the beginning of the 20th century when the island was settled by different other groups, other people from the mainland. So this culture just doesn't exist anymore. But it shows us, well, fluidly, vividly how concepts like normality can differ from the context they are viewed in. And in the past, deaf people have been treated much more in deficient way than on the Martha vineyard. And processes of othering usually have taken places from external point of views, point of views where the deaf people, well, haven't been a normal part of the society. By the way, if you're interested in the language, in the island, in the culture of Martha's Vineyard, there's a quite good book from Nora Ellen Gross. Everyone here spoke sign language. So the good question is, why is there still this resistance of this deaf culture to oralist society or mainstream society? Why isn't it everywhere like it is there? Like sign is a second language to other languages. And of course, we can go much more into history, and there we can see how the struggles between hearing people and deaf people well, are the roots for even today's conflicts. On the one hand, we have the example of Martha's Vineyard that shows that coexistence could work, but this was based on the very regional island culture. And the roots of deaf resistance, deaf culture are, well, lie much more in the past than these specific case would do. And we can go in the 16th century, where the Spanish monk Pedro Ponce de Leon taught deaf children the use of orally spoken language. This is one of the first, I guess one of the first big attempts to teach deaf children language and to build up an educational system for deaf children. And his goal was mainly to make them inheritable, which means that they can get the money of their parents, for example, when they die. So it was not his aim wasn't to include them into the mainstream society. However, more intense steps in education, deaf educating deaf children were taken by a variety of institutions in the late 18th century. In Paris, Abbé de l'Épée, I hope I pronounced this correctly, yeah? Founded the first school for deaf children in the year 1770, and 8 years later in 1778, Samuel Heinecke founded a school for deaf in Leipzig. It's a German city. And although both people addressed the same population, deaf children, and education of deaf children, both methods differed widely. The so-called French method of Abbé de l'Épée was based on the idea that sign language is the native language of people born deaf. Although his aim also was to teach deaf children speech in order to integrate them into the society, he made use of sign within his school. And Samuel Heinecke, on the other hand, had the same goal, to integrate people in the society, but he was a strong advocate of the spoken language, and therefore pupils in his school weren't allowed to use signs. This controversy had been very powerful and influences deaf education even today. And I know it from Germany, there are still schools which prevent deaf students, pupils, to use sign, and other schools which allow them. Well, there's a controversy until today. There are some other examples, by the way, that show that a shift between approaches in the methods how to educate deaf children shift even within one regional area. In the United States, for instance, most schools adopted first the French methods until the 1860s. So in the United States, pupils were allowed to use sign. I'm quoting now the historian Barsch again. As a result, the language and the method became a central part of a developing deaf culture. The schools fostered a common sign language across the nation. Thus, by the mid-19th century, deaf cultural self-awareness was established and expanding. In the late 19th century, critics' growing concerns over the separate deaf culture inspired a unified attack on the community. And these concerns of the about the deaf culture were also a result of nation-building processes which took place in the 19th century in the United States. Concretely, the nation faced a dramatic migration movement since the end of the Civil War. So attempts, quoting Barsch again, to reassert a unified American identity took on various forms. Promising to instill an education fitted to modern needs, schools not only instructed young people in rudimentary academic subjects, but also emphasized unity through common values such as democracy, industry, and civic responsibility. And of utmost importance, schooling promoted the use of common American language, which was English, spoken English. Training, speech, and lip reading became the principal means of pressing this agenda on the deaf community. So, you can see that there are resistance to mainstream societies. You can find the roots in the history when the majority wanted to press their point of view how to speak over the minority of deaf people. Well, and deaf leaders until to now fear that the infiltration of oralism could split up the deaf community, because isolated students could create, for example, their own signs of communication with each other, thus losing the historic traditions of experiencing appropriate, eloquent signs from master talkers. It was feared that deaf communities, therefore, hampered to carry further specific cultural values such as pride in their identity and appreciation for the language and folklores that unite them. And as you saw with the video of the child Heather, the struggle goes on until now. So, I turn now a bit towards history didactics. When I talk about the word history didactics, do you know what is meant with it? No? Okay, so I don't know. I know in England they don't know the word, so didactics isn't known there. So it's okay. So the history of the deaf can be an exciting issue for history didactics, my opinion. It can be used to example as an example to show that cultural diversity is also the diversity of abilities. And next to these theoretical limits, there's a practical issue which is important for countries where pupils with disabilities are still separated from those without disabilities. So I'm talking in the terms of inclusion now. In essence, in these countries, one group of pupils lack the awareness of disabilities due to the absence of classmates with disabilities, while the other groups find that their own disabilities separate them from nearly all other children and teenagers in their peer group. Deaf history can be an outstanding example to show how group formation processes work. And it's also an example to illustrate the emergence of systems of exclusion by mechanisms of othering within societies. And furthermore, it addresses issues of cultural and subculture, if you want so, by showing how exclusion could form distinct identities and their environment. The German historian Martin Lücke remarks that societies all around the world are characterized by heterogeneity and social disparities. And he also addresses that questions how race, class, gender impact historical consciousness of people and groups need to be integrated into planning of history lessons, for example. Based on the theoretical background of diversity and intersectionality studies, he analyzes how social differences, this could also be old, young, men, women, poor, rich, migrant, native, and so on, result in social inequalities. And by referring to the trias of race, class, and gender as one of the starting points of social inequalities, he points towards other categories like religion or even disabilities to say this must be an important part of history lessons in school in order to make people know what's the historical sources for current inequality, sorry for that. And when we follow the ideas of history teaching, then we can say that doing history is always an act of doing narration, and that we also need to teach how children deal with history and deal with historical narrations. He argues that telling stories about inequality promotes the understanding for categories like social inequalities. So, you can read it better here. This means for the practice of teaching history in schools that stories which approach the point of intersection between categories of social difference and power are the ones to look at. This also indicates that a drawback from the coherent big stories, nation, migration and so on, could favor different small stories, like what are different persons facing diversity, facing exclusion, doing in history in order to make understand how social exclusion today works. And I said next to these theoretical implications, the facts that inclusion is becoming more and more popular in all kind of countries, and I think even, not even, but I know that here in Belgium as well, inclusion is a big point. The stories of minorities also can be valuable for history lessons in order to make the diversity of societies visible. Because at the moment, when you look at textbooks, for example, of history, you see big pictures, you see big stories. Very much of these stories has to do with nation war, power, and so on. But there are so many groups, unheard groups in the history that still needs to be part of history lessons. We had the same situation about in the 1960s, 1970s with women's history. So there was a great movement in the 1970s to include women's history, or even to include women into history in school books, for example. So this happened to a much wider way now than it was before, but maybe the same can get real for disabilities. We don't know that disability is a matter of teaching in schools now. And actually, the problem is that there aren't resources, for example, for deaf history. So when you look at the textbooks, when you look at the internet, different other resources for history teaching, and you try to find any stories which deal with disabilities, you don't find very much. You can find, for example, some teaching materials about individual people with disabilities, like Helen Keller. She was a deafblind writer and activist from the United States. And these are good examples, even to show that people with disabilities can perform and they can be successful. But on the other hand, the personalized way of viewing history can also tend to make the picture of some kind of disabled superhero, because this person is only one of the group called disabled people, and maybe it's not a very realistic view when we focus on individual persons. So one more, the attempt to say more small stories from normal people in school lessons. Maybe they are better to promote awareness of diversity in history. If you have a look, just as a little excursion, on the Disability History Museum, you can find lots of resources for teaching disability history. Just to show you one which deals about the struggle between Alexander Graham Bell. He was the inventor, he did invent the telephone, I guess. There's a German one who also said he did. So, and Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, and Graham Bell, for example, was one who used was a strict oralist and said, I want to make deaf people talk. And Gallaudet was a promoter of sign language. You can find, for example, resources about the struggle between them. And it's quite interesting to teach with these resources, but maybe this also is a black and white picture of one position contrary to the other position. I'd just like to show you these examples in order to make clear that, from my opinion, the resources which are now there don't fit the requirements of diversity education in a way, because they all focus on single super persons or on conflict, and not on the normalcy of diversity within history and current education. So a lot needs to be done when teaching disability history or diversity history. A lot needs to be done even on the basis of teaching resources. Well, I'll come to the end. So, deaf history, in my opinion, is a very fruitful example for teaching the history of cultural minorities and their relationship to mainstream societies. Disability is a dimension of difference, such as gender, ethnicity, social status. Therefore, this kind of being different is another fruitful category both when thinking about history and teaching history in schools. Given that millions of people are disabled, I just have the numbers of Germany, so it's about 7.3 million people in Germany who have the status disabled. Of course, old people also. But we see there's a large number of people who are disabled. Disability history is a matter of history education, nearly as much, or at least as much, as migration history, war history, and so on. Deaf history also shows processes of identity formation and its historical emergence. Furthermore, this example illustrates what worries minorities about the majorities in societies which approach diversity. And what more can this deaf history contribute to the history didactics? Given answer, I would like to quote from Rebecca Atwood's book, Words Made Flesh. Deaf history, quote, is a story that teaches us about disability, cultural difference, tolerance, language, and diversity. In other words, it's a story larger than deaf people. It tells us about ourselves. It asks us to consider how we embrace or reject differences in our midst. And finally, please remember the experiment, the Robert's Cave experiment I was talking about in the beginning of the presentation. How could we achieve that people with deafness or people with disabilities in general aren't excluded, for example, in schools? Well, this is a big one, but we need to work with this. Maybe a way could be to decategorize them, which means to stop calling them disabled, to stop doing external otherings while talking about the phenomenon linked to this categories or to these groups in school. Of course, we are not the only ones who can decide this. This is a political issue in many ways, but well, every one of us can do politics. So the decategorization of people taking place in schools is one of the most, for me, most urgent future tasks we all have to do. This, by the way, doesn't mean that the internal othering, in a way, should be prevented. Of course, groups form themselves and give themselves identities, that's okay. But then it's an identity the group gave itself, and not an identity others ascribed to them. Well, I remember, repeat myself, it's not a problem that there are groups, but it's a problem when specific groups are being attributed negatively. So, what does this all mean for schools? And now I'm doing some, well, buzzwords in a way. First, let's give this. Show your pupils the mechanisms of othering. Tell them that this is normal, that this is not a problem in general. Teach them the historical roots of diversity and exclusion. Let them wonder why people use categories to describe other peoples or groups of people all the time. Maybe this objective approach of teaching, next to emotional approaches or affective approaches, helps to prevent that your pupils are driven by prejudice and personal beliefs in their later lives without reflecting them. Teaching history in schools pretty much differs from historical research because the aim is to impact the present, not to find out how we can imagine the past. So use the history to show why we now want to change the system, why we want to have a system without exclusion, but use the historical examples. But also give your pupils a common task or a common interest to prevent that they start to hate each other in the case the objective approach does not work. So my final word, and then we can talk a bit about this, use deaf history, use disability history as an example to show how stupid external othering is, which is done by diversities and by humanity. Thanks a lot.
Okay. I hope you invite the invitation to talk or to sign. So I think you were by now diversity experts after having followed the course of this semester. So if you have any questions for Sebastian related to the talk, related to the presentation, or related to the topic that he spoke about, please ask them.
Maybe I have a question. I heard that here in Belgium also inclusive education is raising or increasing. Yeah? And in Germany we have a big struggle, especially with history teaching or history didactics, because there are so many people saying that, for example, people with intellectual disabilities are not able to learn history. So they could learn the watch, reading the watch, or could learn how to say yesterday, tomorrow, and so on. But a lot of people deny that these people can do history lessons, for example. What do you think? Or other question: is there history education also for people with special needs here in Belgium?
It depends on the kind of special needs, I think.
Okay.
If you are very, very autistic or something, it might be harder, but if you just are dyslexic, it's quite easy to learn.
Okay.
But in Belgium, the inclusiveness goes as far as when you are really disabled, then you also go to a different school. So when you're not able to say yesterday or tomorrow, I don't think you should be included in normal schools.
Okay.
Because then you would be very disabled, I think, to learn.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what other people think about it. The normal disabilities are really easy to teach history too, I think.
And normal disabilities is like deafness or physical disabilities?
Yeah, that's not a problem, I think, physical.
Okay.
Well, actually, the law has just changed, so they're trying to be more inclusive now, and so people can go to regular school. Apart from that, we have special needs education in different schools, but now it's only starting that more people with all kinds of disabilities go to regular in regular schools.
Okay.
It's only just starting, and so the problems and the controversy is now based in I think how is it in primary schools.
Okay.
And at this point, there are people, disabled people of all sorts in secondary schools, but not so much at this point. The law has just changed this year.
Yeah. It's pretty much the same in Germany, and maybe in Germany it's even more complicated, and it's stupid because we don't have we have a very difficult school system with we have 3 tiers of schools, so primary school is 4 years, and then we have like the basic school, Hauptschule, Realschule, like a middle school, and then the Gymnasium as for the best, and then we have all these different kinds of special educational schools, which now are closing down due to law issues. But the struggle, especially for subjects like history or philosophy, social sciences, is that many of the people who are advocates of this subject say the quality of our history teaching will go down when all these disabled people come to our schools. And that's quite interesting because that's what I wanted to say. History, at least in Germany, still focuses on big history like nation building processes, like war, maybe social qualities, but doesn't include all the small stories by normal people, and of course disabled people are normal people, like normal members of a society. So that's quite interesting struggle we have now in Germany.
But you are talking about mentally disabled people who, for
also,
whom, to whom the history lessons should be too difficult. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this. If inclusion does also mean that different topics are not for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially like humanities. The struggle in Germany is that especially the humanities say no, they can't do it. people from the mathematics or physics, they much more find ways to include even people with intellectual disabilities into normal lessons. But people with the subject like history say, no, that's they need to do narration. They need to well, be able to really perform complicated longue durée thinking and so on. And so the struggle now is that disability is far away from history in schools because the promoters of history don't see the value of disabilities in general. So that's, I just wanted to hear if it's quite similar here.
Actually, I think the discussion hasn't started yet.
No.
It's only, at this point, it's only on the level of primary schools that the discussion has started. I think in most people with disabilities who go to a secondary school here will probably go to BSO, I guess. Won't go to a very theoretical system.
Okay.
And maybe later the controversy will start there.
Okay.
I think so. I don't know what other people think.
But we also have people with autism in our classes, right?
Yeah.
And they attend the same
Yeah.
subjects, okay.
Yeah, that's autism. That's very good.
And is there a rule? Also, which kind of disabilities is in the class and which kind is not? Or unwritten rule?
In primary school they have people with the syndrome of Down already, but I don't think they go to the secondary school. I don't know.
I think it depends.
Yes, in my school we had one. A girl want to be a photographer. We have photography in our school, but we decided not to allow her in school.
I think in theory, children with disabilities now have the legal right to attend whatever school they like, but when you look at the practice, and for example, several undercover journalists have proven it, directors of schools still tend to be still tend to exclude these kind of children by saying we do not have enough place, we do not have enough teachers.
The teachers group who can decide.
Okay. Not anymore. No, until a certain point.
With that girl with the syndrome of Down, we decided we don't have the resilience, the veerkracht, I think, to cope with that problem.
Okay.
Yes, we don't know how to handle her.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I had people with children with different disabilities in my class, from blind children, deaf children,
yes, that's
with physical disabilities, autism.
That's okay. That's okay.
That I had.
Deaf. We have already deaf children in our classroom.
Do they sign or do they?
No, they have this with that kind of toestel. So you have a microphone.
Okay,
and
okay.
Yeah, but they usually have something that they can. The two children I had in class heard a bit.
Yeah.
A bit, yes.
Okay.
I have a microphone.
Can I ask another question? Is there any research available with regard to the amount of representations of persons with disabilities in history textbooks?
No.
Because you referred to this kind of thing and you hypothesized a little bit about it. But
that's just what I was. It was not a research. I don't know that there's any research, and it's just a subjective point of view. All I've searched for, disability wasn't in there. And that's quite interesting. Maybe this is one of my last questions to you, because you can have holidays or so. Simply, what do you think about the idea making special history, for example, for deaf people? The background of my question, and this is maybe a background of all what I was presenting today, is you know, in Germany, and I guess here also, we have this big situation with refugees now coming from Syria and so on. And we have very good experiences doing special history lessons, for example, for children from Syria. Because we don't want to face them with German national building from the 19th century when they just faced war and trauma and all the things. We want to well, bring them in contact with their own history, and with very good well, experiences with that. But we don't have a similar situation, for example, for people with deafness, so, or for people with visual impairment. So simply, do you think it is useful to offer special histories to special groups, let's say like this? Just your opinion. Or maybe I'm totally wrong and just give them nation building or everybody.
I think if you want to include them, you shouldn't give them exclusive histories, but you can get a few chapters of it, especially for them, but not like their whole school career. That would be still exclusive, I think.
Okay.
I wonder, do you mean like, so only deaf history for deaf people, or can oral people also attend these classes? Or
sure. The situation like it is now is there's a class totally diverse. There's one with a background from other culture, one with a disability, one with a middle class, one with a high class background, and they are all getting the same history, and usually it's national history or it's the big history. So nobody of these diverse people is confronted with the personal history. It's all the time history, well, transported by political decisions in a way. So the idea to offer more small stories within history lessons, which means there's a diverse group, and we do deaf history, and we do migration history, and we do maybe also nation history, just to show the diversity which is in the class in the history lesson. That's the idea behind it. The idea of showing why diversity is taking place, and to deconstruct it by showing the different historical lines which led to diversity, but also by accepting that there are different stories for everybody. That's the idea behind it. So not exclusive history for special groups, but diverse histories for diverse groups. But do you need to stick to curricula when you teach later in schools? So do you have the ability to do your own stuff in schools?
Depends. It depends from in which school you teach.
Okay.
If you are in Catholic schools, that's most of Flanders have Catholic schools, and you can actually basically choose what you teach. You only have some guidelines, but you can make your own decisions. If you want to teach disability history, it's possible. There are even some textbooks who offer the opportunity. There's one textbook I know.
So it's some kind of core curricula where you only have a top subject like, well, for
modern
example,
age. For example, modern age, you have to teach something of a non-Western culture. You have to talk about political, economical, and cultural topics. And there are some other goals you have to reach, but it's not stipulated which subjects you have to tackle that year.
I'm not sure if it is the case, but if I listen to your story, I can imagine that for some history teachers it can become a little bit too much. I mean, the issue of diversity is very, very broad, and one of the consequences could be that in your courses you have to include something about gender, about disability, about class, about race, what else did I note down, about sexual preferences, homosexuality, transgender, name it. I mean, if you have to include all of that, in how many hours do you have in a year?
50 max.
Max
50
max.
And the other
multiply
20,
it
20,
with 6
25.
in secondary school. I'm not sure what your opinion on the matter is. Can you, for example, deal with all the issues you have in mind only by focusing on deaf history, for example? Or do you need all of it?
No, I don't think
it's an important
I don't
question.
think that you need all of it. For me, the point is, why do we have history lessons? We don't have it to learn everything about history. We have history lessons to influence our current lives. And our current lives are, well, based on the ideas of democracy, of equality, and of, well, acceptance of diversity. So what you need to do, in my opinion, in history is to show examples which make clear how inequalities are rooted in history. But I guess it's okay if it's one example to show these mechanisms. Othering works like this, othering works like this. You can adopt it to other situations as well. So the aim of history is not to learn factual knowledge, but to, well, promote special attitudes with the students, with the pupils. The pupils should, for example, have the attitude to know that their own beliefs, their own prejudice might be something which is rooted in history. So maybe this concept of spiral curriculum, Brunner, is quite good because you have different topics like otherness. You can do it in the primary school, you can do it then in other grades, and always repeat this core topics to show the mechanisms which are behind that, in order to hope that the students and pupils understand how these mechanisms work in real life. So, simple example. I think it's a good success when students after school read a newspaper with a bad headline like "Youth refugees are all taking our money," and understand that this is something which is not true, which is standing there, but which is well, some kind of an othering process, some kind of a stereotype. And I think this is the aim of history lessons, to promote attitudes, to promote critical view on the society. And I think it's only examples which can be used. So it's always about power and how societies deal with power and inequalities. And you can use different examples. And usually it's small groups who are disadvantaged by minorities. So to answer your question, I don't think you can teach everything.
Okay. Yeah. One of the problems that my final question, one of the problems that I see is that, of course, if you look at history, historical consciousness has often been used in order to categorize people. For example, people with mental disabilities, you refer to it. If you do not know the difference between today and yesterday, then there is something wrong, and we call that difference mental disability. What you do now is slightly different. You make use of historical consciousness in order to decategorize. And I'm not sure how the two relate to one another. I mean, how can you make sure that the historical consciousness that you're after will decategorize and not, as in the past, create categories, as you mentioned?
Oh, okay, I see. That's a hard task. One of my ideas is showing different versions of the same story. For example, showing different versions of deaf culture. We have this Martha Weinert story, and we have the Samuel Heinecke story, and we have this Child Heather story. So the same topic is deafness and how to deal with this attribute. And just by showing that there are so many different ways, and that is so dependent from the cultural background and the societal background, which results from these origins, maybe could show that well, these categories are at least fluid. I think people use categories, and I think language needs to use categories. But one aim of history lessons could be that the people who are confronted with the histories reflect how stable these categories are. I think it's even enough if they say, oh, maybe it's not like I thought before. Maybe it's not like they tell me. Maybe there are not disabled people, but I know there are people who are blind. But this blind person is so different from this person in the wheelchair. They maybe have nothing in common, except the category which in our society we give them and say they are disabled. And in other societies they didn't give them the same labels. A very good example is learning disabilities. We talked about it. I know in Germany, and I guess here in Belgium as well, there's a category of learning disabled people, which is between normal people and intellectual disabled people. And in Germany we have schools for learning disabled people. And correct me if I'm wrong, I guess here there are schools also for learning disabled people. And the interesting thing is, there's only very few countries in the whole world which have this category. It's only in some middle European countries where the category of learning disabilities is defined as we do it. We have the English word learning disabilities, but that's much more what in German is called Teilleistungsstörungen, which means people who have problems to read or to do mathematics. But the whole concept of learning disabilities is something which simply exists, doesn't exist everywhere. And this is the strange situation that people who are learning disabled in Germany, who are having very specific institutions their whole life, from the first grade to their work life, the same people would be without any category, for example, in the United States. So they wouldn't have special schools for them. They wouldn't have special programs for them. Maybe they wouldn't be disabled because nobody noticed them as being disabled. And that's quite interesting to show how does this category come from. And to stick with the example of learning disabilities, it was simply an academic strike of the 19th century to build a school for those people who are not good enough for the mainstream schools. So they said we need Hilfsschulen, special schools, and as a result there was a whole academic field for learning disability pedagogy, and until now we have a huge system of care and education for people with learning disabilities, and the same group wouldn't have that in another country where the category doesn't exist. And that's something I think history can show very good. Categories and stigmatization is so dependent from the societies you live in. Yeah.
Any other pressing question? Or you're all longing for some holidays? In that case, I would like to thank Sebastian Barsch once more for his excellent introduction into the history didactics, and especially with this focus on disability history. Thank you, Sebastian.